Hello. Like most parents, Julie Dolinsky takes her daughter to the doctor each year for her recommended vaccinations. She does anything and everything she can to keep her daughter as safe and as healthy as possible. However, a 2012 U.S. Vaccine for Children study has her worried about the efficacy of her daughter's vaccinations. Investigators from the Department of Health and Human Services found some pretty startling statistics. They found that 89% of vaccine providers failed to monitor vaccine storage temperatures properly. They found that 93% of those providers failed to store vaccines correctly. They found that fully 96% didn't even use the right equipment to store vaccines properly in the first place. This potentially renders those vaccines ineffective, leaving you and your children at risk for serious preventable diseases. Flipped Health is developing Airevacs, a vaccine drying process for liquid vaccines, kind of like Dippin' Dots for vaccines, that enables pharmaceutical manufacturers to create the safest, simplest, most effective vaccines possible through the use of our patented thin film freeze drying process. We're developing Airevacs to do three things. First, to eliminate the need for refrigerated transportation and storage. Second, to increase shelf life. And third, to enable access to those high-growth emerging markets who lack access to refrigeration and electricity. Each year, pharmaceutical manufacturers spend more than $1 billion Canadian dollars in packaging, transport, storage, waste, and expired vaccine buyback. Our process creates a vaccine powder with demonstrated long-term stability under a wide range of conditions without the need for refrigeration. I'm Cheryl Tolkoff, and we're Flipped Health. And with that, I'd like to introduce Brandon, who's going to tell you more about our global vaccine market. Brandon?
Thank you, Cheryl. So, according to the World Health Organization, in 2013, the global market for vaccines was valued at $24 billion. Now, even though this only represents 2 to 3% of the overall pharmaceutical industry, it's growing extremely rapidly. It's more than quadrupled in value from $5 billion in the year 2000 to where it is today. In fact, vaccines have become a very profitable and attractive niche to pharmaceutical companies, especially research and innovation-based companies such as Flipped Health. But how are these vaccines actually delivered to people? Well, the diagram behind me represents what we at Flipped Health call the problematic cold chain. Vaccines must be maintained at temperatures between 2 and 8 degrees Celsius. Any transportation and storage outside of that temperature range for an extended period of time risks damaging the vaccine, possibly rendering it ineffective. Every spot on this chart represents the possibility for that to occur and represents lost revenue to pharmaceutical companies. But more importantly, you risk administering an ineffective vaccine to a patient, leaving them exposed to the very thing they were wishing to prevent, which is a pretty scary thought for a parent who needs to vaccinate their child. So I'm going to pass it over to Liz now, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about the excitement that Airevacs has attracted.
Thank you, Brandon. Throughout this process, Flipped Health interviewed over 100 individuals in the United States, the UK, Belgium, India, and right here in Canada, all associated with the vaccine industry. Those range from large pharmaceutical companies like Merck or Serum Institute to small rural clinics. We also spoke with the Gates Foundation, the leading global humanitarian organization. The purpose of these interviews was to determine the need for the dry vaccine technology. Some of the feedback that we received from those interviews are as follows. First, the director of Passport Health that has over 230 clinics in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. They typically service people traveling to exotic locations and small corporate clinics. Their director stated if the technology were available today, she would purchase it on the spot. We also spoke with the director of oncology and market research at Merck, who showed interest in the technology for their Gardasil vaccine, stating Merck would spend money on this. And lastly, our favorite, from the senior program director of vaccine development at the Gates Foundation, likened our technology to the Holy Grail. eliminating the need for the cold chain. Clearly, feedback from the industry shows that problems do exist with vaccine storage, vaccine waste, and vaccine packaging. The opportunity. 98% of vaccines are liquid vaccines. Therefore, they must all adhere to the cold chain, which you heard Brandon describe in detail. Unfortunately, 30% of all vaccines are wasted because they do not adhere to the cold chain or they expire, making high costs for large pharmaceutical companies that have individual buyback agreements with healthcare providers. Just alone in our home state of Texas last year, 11,000 vaccines were wasted. And that's just a public number, since they're the only ones that must report those numbers. Next, I'll be followed by Israel, who will detail Flipped Health's Airevacs drying process.
Let me tell you about Airevacs. There are two parts to the Airevacs platform solution. The first part is a novel thin film freeze-drying process that can stabilize a vaccine for a wide range of conditions. It was developed at the University of Texas, is patent protected, and has been proven to work with vaccines such as Hep B or Gardasil. The second part is packaging the vaccine so that it can be stored, transported, and administered the safest way possible. Flipped Health has established relationships with companies such as Mystic Pharmaceutical in Austin to ensure the right packaging is part of the complete solution. Airevacs is different from cold chain in that it makes the process simpler. As Brandon mentioned, the cold chain requires a lot of moving parts, costly equipment, and heavy logistics just to ensure the vaccine can remain stabilized for the temperature range of 2 to 8 degrees Celsius. And still, it results in a lot of vaccine waste. Airevacs simplifies the process and makes it as easy as something like Kool-Aid or dried milk. When you take milk from a liquid form into a powder form, you can easily transport it and store it as you like without the need for refrigeration. When you're ready to consume, you simply add water and enjoy. Similarly, vaccines dried with the Airevacs process do not have the need for refrigeration and can easily be reconstituted by adding sterile water when you're ready to administer. Airevacs has the advantage over cold chain in that it can guarantee the stability of the vaccine for a temperature range from 0 to 40 degrees Celsius. This significantly reduces the cost of transportation equipment and logistics needed to ensure you're adhering to the cold chain temperature ranges. It also reduces the amount of vaccine wastage, which, as Liz mentioned, can be up to 30%. For big pharmaceutical companies, that means a lot less buybacks, which means cost savings. For us in this room, more importantly, it means safer vaccines are administered. Airevacs can also guarantee the preservation of the potency of the vaccine because of its patent-protected thin film freeze-drying process, so that the safest quality form of the vaccine is administered. So how does Airevacs stack up against the competition? Of course, pharmaceutical manufacturers can opt to do nothing and continue to depend on problematic cold chain to stabilize their vaccine. As already mentioned, costly equipment, heavy logistics, still vaccine wastage. Regarding the competition, Airevacs stands out in 3 ways. Airevacs is the only solution with the thin film freeze-drying process that can guarantee a high stability and efficacy of the vaccine because it stabilizes the vaccine in a fine, thin film, uniform dry powder and particle size. Second, Airevacs is one of the few solutions that can guarantee stability well after reconstitution, so that no vaccine is lost due to early reconstitution. And finally, Airevacs is the only solution that has proven to work with a high-profile vaccine such as Merck's Gardasil. And for us, that means a competitive advantage and a great opportunity to partner up with pharmaceutical manufacturers in the future. I'm going to pass it over to Daniel, and he's going to let you know a little bit of the timeline of how we're going to execute this.
All right, thank you, Israel. All right, as Israel said, I'm going to go over a timeline of our key milestones for the next 4 years of operations. Our first year will start with fundraising. We can't do anything without funding. The things that we'll be doing with this funding are patent licensing from the UT Tech Transfer Office. There are 2 patents that are currently available, the thin film freeze-drying process patent and the aluminum adjuvant patent. We'll also be making a key hire of someone that is a vaccine expert with FDA experience. And we'll also be continuing the process R&D for the thin film freeze drying process to get it ready for mass production equipment development, the kind of equipment that large pharmaceutical companies would use to, create large batches of this stuff. So in years 2 and 3, we will be continuing the equipment. We'll be beginning equipment R&D. We'll be developing partners that will allow us to outsource this development. One of these, we've actually contacted one of a potential partner called Patheon, who does equipment development in the pharmaceutical space, and they will help us to get the equipment further along enough until we can complete all of the validation that needs to go to sorry, I'm drawing a blank. Clinical trials, thank you, to pass the standards that it needs to be able to be FDA approved. And after this point at year 3, we have various exit options. After the equipment has been FDA approved, we have the option of selling our process and equipment to a manufacturer, or we can begin to license our equipment and our process to third parties, and this will actually increase our valuation. And another exit possibility will be taking our process through the process FDA trials with a specific vaccine, like Gardasil. And we expect our early exit for early FDA to be around $120 million, and as we get towards the later stages in the FDA process, to be $425 million. And with that, I'll hand it off to Cheryl.
Thank you. So today we're here to ask you for a $1.5 million investment in exchange for a 20% stake in Flipped Health. Using those funds, we'll execute on some of those key milestones that Daniel just went through for you here. Flipped Health is composed of a strong, diverse, cross-functional team of 5 members who bring more than 60 years of experience in engineering, manufacturing, process and product development, sales, and finance. We also enjoy the strong support of our 2 researchers, Dr. Bill Williams and Dr. Quee, who each have over 25 years of pharmaceutical experience, hold extensive vaccine patents, and have commercialization experience. We've also collected a stellar group of mentors and advisors who've also helped guide us through the process. And with that, I'd like to draw your attention today to the temperature in this room. It's a nice, comfortable 24 degrees Celsius, a temperature that's already well outside the cold chain requirements for vaccines. In the 15 minutes we've had to present to you, you can see how quickly the ice in the glass has begun to melt. It shows just how easy even small excursions can begin to potentially damage vaccines. Our process, Airevacs, eliminates the probability of this happening. It's a problem that we can make go away. We thank you for your attention, and now would like to take questions from you. Thank you.
Can you guys help me distinguish between, you use the word proven a lot, which is interesting pre-FDA trials, right? So help me understand the exact what is and isn't proven. We've proven that there's no health impact. We've proven that it reconstitutes properly. Help me understand the proof points, the real scientific proof points.
Mm-hmm. And Cheryl can go a little bit into the details, and I think she has a slide. And what we've been able to do, our professors have been able to do, is do this with lab mice, and so that's where we're at this point. And a lot of what we've done is there. So we can prove that we can stabilize for a good 10 months, which is very standard with that, and as well as the temperature ranges that are required. And so I'll let her pull the slides up and kind of speak a little bit more. But the next step will be, we partnered up with the Keeling Center in Austin, Texas, and they're preclinical trials, and so we'll do 8 monkeys then, and we'll take it through and through. We understand we can't fully say that this is a guarantee stabilized product until then, but we can say that we have data as far as lab mice are concerned.
So do we know the impact that the aluminum processing has on the efficacy of the vaccine?
Those are the things that we have studied. So to build on what Israel began with, we have the particle aggregation, we have the particle dispersion, we have the effectiveness and efficacy studied over that 10-month period up to mice models. And so we've built out the preclinical phase, which next would take us into immunogenicity and toxicity, but we do have data in mice models that shows that it doesn't degrade in its effectiveness, that the particles stay uniform and dispersed in solution, and it doesn't lose stability.
Okay, thank you.
Your financial models show that you really never make any money until you sell, but it's a long time. You know, if you haven't got through these trials, the longer it takes to get through these trials, the longer it takes to sell, to exit, really.
That's correct. Yes.
So, what drives your exit values? How do you come up with those numbers? What support do you have for those?
Well, we have looked at other acquisitions that have taken place in these spaces. We don't have exact equipment that has been acquired that is just like ours, but we've done a lot of secondary research into companies that have been acquired, and they have similar acquisition valuations.
Can you give me an example of one that spent similar amounts of money and got similar exit values? Like, you're talking about spending, what, I don't know, $10 or $15 million on this by the time you're done, or maybe more, and raising money all the way through, and then coming out at the end of the day with $120 to $490 million of exit values. Who does that?
We actually had one of those in our business case that was the closest similar model to ours in the example there, and a couple others that we referenced, but there was one that was very much like ours that was in the vaccine space and developing equipment and sold. So that was our closest allegory, so that's where we had picked some of those ranges from, but we're still working on it because where we've been working is there's an acquisition model, but there's also the potential for us to license, but we're still fleshing out those income streams.
I have a question. I can see the tremendous value in terms of transporting this. Have you done any studies on the impact on the end user and the fact that you're probably giving them more work because they have to make the Kool-Aid, which I'm sure will be delicious. And so, but just even in terms of time and motion studies, are they even equipped to do it? Like, have you sort of looked at that side of it?
We could definitely do more research on that, but one thing we do understand is that we have to take as much of the human risk factor away as possible. And a lot of our competitors, what they're doing is they're being the complete solution, a little bit of what we presented, where they're not just the process, they're also the packaging. And so part of our packaging would include the diluent as well as the process as well. And we also have the ability to do nasal sprays. And so as much as we can contain, we will, to remove the workload and make it as easy as possible to just pull that out and administer as you need to.
Have you talked to any of the HMOs or hospitals in terms of how you actually get into their institutions and their processes? Because from what I've seen in the United States, it's nice to get FDA, but all of a sudden you've got to start convincing people, and they've got their boards and everything, and essentially you start bouncing other people. Any discussions with HMOs?
So that was, well, we started first with Passport Health because they buy large quantities of vaccines, about getting into their system. We've only spoken with the healthcare chains that are actually in the Austin, Texas area right now. So we had a contact with Seton and with St. David's where they talked about how they approach it, but it's until it's approved, it's kind of a chicken and egg challenge for us, but they all conceptually like the concept for it. In fact, one of them we spoke to right before the competition had just thrown away, $60,000 because they had a refrigerator malfunction as they were setting up a new facility, and so she was very interested. We hit her at the right time after they just had a fairly large excursion for them in terms of cost. So there's interest, but we'd have to continue to work getting into their stream.
I guess the other question is, does this go beyond vaccines to other sorts of medication, antibiotics, things of that nature?
The work today has been limited to a specific subclass of vaccines, but that's where the future research that we're working on with the University of Texas is different types of adjuvants and also non-adjuvants, and really any type of liquid biologic that's currently restricted by cold chain requirements. Just simply have to prove those out in research in the lab.
Are you an equipment company, a pharmaceutical company, a research company? Like, what is it really that you're making? I'm really confused.
We're developing the process and the equipment to support scaling up manufacturing of it. So we're not going to be a drug maker. We're either going to license or sell the process and equipment to vaccine manufacturers or directly to the pharmaceutical people who own the vaccines or the biologics that are made using those processes.
So what's the equipment? Like, what's the thing that I buy from you?
So it's
Assuming you were actually going to sell something somewhere down the road, what is it that I would purchase?
So it's a piece of equipment that would work in conjunction with the lyophilizers that they currently have to kind of dry materials out. What it is, it's a rotating drum, and the liquid basically comes down in droplet form on the drum. Liquid nitrogen keeps the drum cold and frozen. It rotates, and as it drips, it creates this thin film, and it has a blade, if you will, that kind of scrapes that film off into a powder that's collected and then sent on to be packaged into the form that the pharmaceutical manufacturers would use.
Is there any waste in that process?
Well, there's waste in every process, and so that's one of the things that we're working on to optimize in manufacturing is how to maximize how much that we get out through that process as well.
They have a working prototype in the lab that we're in the process.
Yeah, we have a
of
lab
investigating.
prototype and a
Wastage
larger
is the-
scale.
Because
No,
if you
not
get a
at this point.
vaccine and you're saying that, you know, there's 30% waste in this cold transportation thing, and you get 20% waste in the process. You don't know what
Absolutely.
that
Yes,
is,
that's
but-
true.
And that's part of our need for, optimizing that process in volume scale rather than the small scale we've been doing it right now, which is much easier to control.
Yeah.
What's the cost of that machine?
Right now, we just have one, and it wasn't very costly to put together at all. Most of the cost actually comes from the liquid nitrogen to run it, more so than the stainless steel and the rotating mechanisms. It's fairly straightforward.
So the dollar amount?
The dollar amount that they spent was to create that one was about $35,000. But again, it was for a kind of what's considered a mid-scale 10 milliliter lyophilizer up to 10-liter lyophilizer range.
And what's the cost of making, 100 milligrams of a dried vaccine?
That depends on the vaccine itself. So for instance, you see numbers in the plan with Gardasil, which is actually one of the most expensive vaccines on the market at $120 a dose.
Yep.
With that, the manufacturing process only accounts for less than a nickel. So 2 to 5 cents, depending on the volume and the form of packaging that it's made in. Now for measles and chickenpox and some of the generic ones that are offered, those, the process would probably outweigh some of the potential benefits in terms of the vaccine cost. And so there's also a range for that as well, but that's something we're working on the numbers for.
Has the FDA ever approved a process like yours?
Well, lyophilization, there is a freezing process that is approved by the FDA and is used for a certain class of drugs, but it hasn't been for the types of proteins we're working with. It's never worked for that because the proteins either clump together or it reduces the efficacy. So it's similar in nature to that, and those are already well understood and used throughout the industry. This is a different form, but does still require approval by the FDA.
You've been focusing on Gardasil here, and then your process is 10 years before you're going to have any revenue on it. What's the risk that Gardasil is replaced with a better or more effective drug from one of the manufacturers to the point your process doesn't work with the new drug?
And throughout the process, we'll be looking into other drugs. The reason that you see Gardasil in here is when we were doing our market research initially, we contacted Merck, and they stated if we could make it work with Gardasil, they'd be very interested in it. And so when we purchased, the professors and the inventors purchased it and actually were able to get a proof of concept with the Gardasil vaccine, we knew and we went back to Merck and said, hey, this actually does work.
How long's Merck's patent on that, on Gardasil?
Well, we wouldn't be actually doing it for Gardasil, so we're not going to
just
make it. We simply did that as proof of
concept.
concept. We've also done it with hepatitis V, tetanus toxoid, so we're working just with a whole class of vaccines that use aluminum adjuvants, and so it's not limited. That was just one of the proof of concept cases that we took through.
But some of the numbers were on Merck savings.
We
on
did
a
that specifically
non-generic
for
drug.
them, yes, because they said, if there's a business case, you put it together for us, we'll talk more and potentially give you some money to help develop it further.
But is Gardasil off patent in 10 years at Merck?
Well, they just came out with a new 9-valent version of it, and so they expect that to continue on. That was just approved by the FDA about 3 months ago now, and so that's a brand new patented version, and it still uses aluminum adjuvants, and so that one's a brand new drug that will continue for its full 25-year protection.
Can you just go over the timeline, and what excitement are you creating in year 3 that you're going to get $4.5 million from new investors?
That's
Say
when-
I'm in at 1.5. By year 3, I don't see a whole lot of, like, is there some approval that happens in year 3 that
That's when
that
we
gets
expect the equipment approvals to happen, that we've got the process and the equipment that's ready and scalable, because that can be used even before there's drug approvals, because we have to get the equipment out there to get it into also the new drug development pipeline, which is where the real long-term potential is start building it in for every new vaccine that goes through. So that's when that happens.
But the risk hasn't, the risk remains about what it is today.
Potentially, but that's when we could also license it, even, we could begin to license it to the pharmaceutical manufacturers, labs, people who'd be interested and are interested in the process, so they could begin running it. So there's a potential for revenue at that point as well.
Okay, and what do they, at that point, what do you contemplate? What part of the amount of the company would they get for that money? It's all preferred share, right? So they wouldn't
Yes.
they wouldn't get any ownership, really.
That we'd have to come to at the time of the valuation and how well we've executed against our milestones.
Okay.
Quick question, just to follow up on one of the questions about the different groups you need to convince to accept this new process outside of the FDA. Is it related at all to the cost? There's going to be significant cost savings, I would assume, of transportation and of storage. Have you quantified those savings, and is that going to accrue to the people that need to accept this process? And is that part of the plan?
That is part of the plan. We didn't show them here, but we actually have quite detailed shipping, transport, and packaging costs for different options and in different parts of the world, because it varies based on country and area of interest. And that's actually where it benefits some of the downstream people you were asking about earlier, the actual vaccine providers, the healthcare chains, because they see those most directly, having to buy the refrigeration and equipment, having to train their staff to do the daily checks and monitoring required, having to throw them away, and then if they're public, report those numbers back to the government. So they would see some significant savings there. And then, with the Merck and the pharmaceuticals, they see more in the waste and the buyback agreements that they have. So different forms of them see different savings, and we've projected those out for potential segments that we'd have to convince for that reason.
There is a market limit needing sterilized water, however. Did you
Yes.
provision for that? Because a lot of the emerging markets, you'd never find sterilized water.
And that's one of the things in the packaging that we're potentially providing is actually a dual chamber. The top chamber has a sterile water in it, the bottom has the powder, and it's only when you depress the syringe that it actually mixes them together. And so we provide it as a complete solution, so you don't have to worry about mixing the right amount, having the water introducing contamination, or even having a highly trained workforce to be able to administer the vaccines.
You should say that in your plan.
That sounded really good.
That's right.
Point taken, thank you.
One, quick, too late. Quick question.
Thank you.